A friend asked me to redo their small 4-foot by 4-foot pantry. The basic wire rack shelves were crowded, it was dark, and a lot of space was underutilized. Some basic requirements were to find a way to use the vertical space and to have good storage for the multitude of spices and rubs that currently fill much of the shelves. This is the basic design I've come up with. The room has a 9-foot ceiling, and to get the most out of it, some sort of step stool would be needed. My friend wanted the steps to be integrated into the overall cabinetry, which posed a huge challenge. Space is at a huge premium, and any sort of built-in step stool would be at the loss of what is already a very small amount of storage volume. I went over a lot of ideas for many months and finally settled on this overall design.
You don't have a better bad idea than this?
This is the best bad idea we have, sir. By far.
The biggest issue was the only place deep enough for steps to be stored was in the corner, and any simpler design would come at the expense of a large amount of storage space. The steps would be the most complex part, so that came first. I knew the pull-out stairs were going to be by far the most complicated portion of this build, so I started by making a cardboard mock-up. I also made a full-size prototype out of some crap plywood, but it's in pieces now because the actual hinge pins made it into the final build. I wanted the sides of the steps to be as strong as possible, so I made them with a sheet of 12-layer birch plywood that I had left over from another project. The only problem is the pantry is going to be made of beech, which doesn't really match. The beech plywood I have is nice, but not 12 layers nice. I also have plenty of beech hardwood and the means to make veneer. While I'm veneering this plywood, I'll go over why I chose this step design. I wanted to gain 18 inches of height with the steps. To be comfortable and safe to use, they needed to be a certain depth, which I didn't really have except in the corner. Unfortunately, the corner also needed to be able to hold some very large and deep cutting boards. I figured if the steps could fold vertically, they could share that depth with the cutting boards. The reason that I'm going to the trouble of veneering the 12-ply birch is that my design requires some metal rods to be embedded into the steps and the step sides, and like everything else with this build, space is at a premium. I can't afford too much excess material where it doesn't need to be, and the steps need to be first and foremost safe to stand on. I learned with my prototype that the side pieces needed to be both strong and very well matched to each other for this design to work. Eventually these pieces of plywood are going to get laminated together, so I only needed to put veneer on the outsides. The pins supporting the steps themselves are going to be 1/2-inch steel rod. The step sides are 2 3/4-inch thick pieces of veneered plywood laminated together, so to make the holes for the rods I used a 1/2-inch bowl bit in my trim router, mirrored on each side of the plywood. Making sure that the channels lined up with each other was one of the more difficult parts of this because they needed to be so precise. I had screwed one of them up on my prototype and I did not want to have to redo any of my final parts. I used temporary alignment dowels during construction to keep both sides of the laminations oriented so they'd properly mirror each other. I needed a template to cut the shapes out, and most of it was pieced together from scraps, but I did cut the handle part out with the diode laser. Looking back on this footage, I'm not 100% sure why I made the first router pass with a top bearing bit, then removed the excess, and then finished with the flush cut bit. I could have just removed the excess and used the flush bit against the template. This was more time consuming, but it did work. Here you can get a little bit of a better idea of how the alignment dowels work. They'll keep the uncut side properly oriented to the cut side during the trace and glue up. When it came time for the actual glue up, I waxed the steel rods so they wouldn't get stuck in the holes as the glue cured. Once I had finished the outer step side, I made the steps themselves from solid beech with the same method as for the rod holes. The steps require a little bit of shaping to make all the hinges work in the least amount of space possible. I tried to avoid doing a full round over on the ends, but it was definitely necessary for the step to be able to fully rotate in both directions. And this also required fully rounding over part of the step side, which I wasn't thrilled about. In the end though, everything worked. I needed to be careful that I didn't lose a hinge rod in the hole because these things went in and out about 100 times over the course of the build, and this particular one could not be left proud as I built the other half of the steps. So I'm having somewhat of a late in the game aesthetic modification to this piece. I was originally going to leave this plywood edge exposed, but I've decided I just can't live with that. Though I'm not going to worry about the interior edges, that just gets too complicated for this part. But I also don't want these legs to be any thicker because I have space constraint issues.
Yeah, Dad, you told us.
So I'm going to remove 3/8 of an inch all the way around the outside of this vertical part of the step. And for this curved part, I have these two pieces that I've sanded down to 3/16 inch thick each, so 3/8 inch thick. And I'm going to steam bend them and wrap them around this edge and then have a straight piece go on this side. And that will keep my overall dimensions at the same size that it is now, but it also make this edge look a lot neater and give me enough meat that I can still put a 1/4 inch round over on the side and not have any exposed plywood. So I put a 3/8 inch rabbet on the outside and then used the flush trim bit to remove the rest. It turned out that I didn't really need to do this with 2 layers, as a single strip 3/8 inch thick would have bent just fine, which is what I did on the larger step side. After the bends had set and dried, I removed the clamps and permanently glued the pieces on. I also had to re-establish my hinge rod holes. The steps will need to both slide and rest on the floor. My prototype had used omnidirectional rollers, which proved to be a very stupid idea, so for the final version I just used chair leg sliders. I cut some 1/16 inch strips to create an offset gap between the small outer step side and the larger inner side. This gave me something to reference my piecemeal template against. By and large, this side of the steps was made using the exact same techniques as the smaller side, though now the steps themselves were included to get all the spacing correct. Unlike the smaller step side, which only had 2 rods in it, the larger one has 5, 2 for the steps and 3 more for the pivot hinges at the back. I'll take a moment to talk about why this needs to pivot. The corner of the shelves is the only place with the depth needed for the steps, but when they pull out from the storage slot, they're at a 45-degree angle to the shelves, so the steps need to pivot 45 degrees in each direction or a total of a 90-degree arc. This will make sense by the end. The higher number of holes required a little more effort in making sure they line up with the other side. I cut a dowel in half to make a jig of sorts. This made it easier to trace the lines that the rods would go through to give me an accurate place to route the channel. I I think it was somewhat of a miracle that everything lined up perfectly the first try. The next minute and a half of this video is pretty much what you'd come to expect at this point. Cutting away excess, gluing the sides together, trimming flush, and attaching a curved wooden edge. I put a slight 1/8 inch round over onto the steps and a 1/4 inch round over on all the vertical parts. Here you can see what this is going to look like temporarily assembled, a pair of steps that swing both ways. I was a little concerned about this one hinge point since it's in tension rather than compression like the rest of them. I decided to add a steel strap to beef up the hinge, cover the raw plywood edge, and overall add some insurance to the step. I forgot to film it, but here's how I used a screw in a countersunk hole to dimple the screw holes in the strap. For this strap to aid the hinge point effectively, it would need to fit tightly, so I needed a good contouring bend. A little bit of primer and paint finished it off. With that part drying, I turned my attention back to the step pivot hinge and the part that would actually be attached to the shelves themselves. Because the steps needed a pivot, I couldn't attach them to the shelves with anything as useful and in current existence like a heavy-duty drawer slide. I only had about 5 inches of depth to play with, and I needed the back half of the pivot hinge to be able to smoothly roll backward and forward on a track without any play or racking. As you'll see, this part will fit into 4 captive tracks with 16 wheels. Is it overbuilt? I don't think so. Is it overdesigned? Absolutely. This little laser cut jig helped make sure that all 16 wheels were perfectly spaced. The wheels would only be installed once, so I did the final finishing on this part before proceeding with the assembly. This is a 3D printed nylon part that puts detents into the hinge to stop at 45 degrees in both directions from center. This is also a 3D printed part, a stud that presses into a bearing which has a 3D printed tire that will go into a track. The stud fits into a tight hole, and a screw adds compression and strength against shear forces, as well as hold the bearing on. With the last of these 16 wheels installed, I was ready to move on to the housing that would contain the steps and tracks. This is basically just going to be a tall, narrow, and deep plywood box open at the front and the bottom. The bottom needs to be open for the larger stair side to be able to slide on the floor. The tracks themselves are going to be made from aluminum U-channel, but those parts need these beach runners to attach to. As long as these runners are precisely aligned, the actual aluminum tracks themselves will be easy to get exactly where they need to be. Incidentally, any burned cuts you see aren't due to a dull or dirty blade. I was just lazy and didn't always swap the high tooth count plywood blade out for a ripping blade on some of these cuts. So here's a little taste of how this is going to work in the tracks. So in the interest of this thing fitting as far back into the corner as possible, I added a 45-degree bevel to the back outer edges. These are the top and bottom pieces, a long one for the enclosed top and a short one for the very back of the bottom. I only used glue on one side because this piece had to be opened up several times as the build progressed. I did a little bit of pre-finishing before I glued on the tracks. This little 3D printed bumper goes in the middle to help keep the steps in the vertical storage position on entry and exit from the storage slot. I ended up redesigning it to be longer, but that wasn't filmed. These little pieces here serve as guides and roller stops. Fun fact, this was design number 1. I had to redesign this part 5 times for various reasons. The first and biggest reason was that I couldn't install them with the steps in the way, and I couldn't install the steps from the back due to the design of the storage box. The final design required a little modification to the front edge, but the screws are now accessible with the stairs installed. Speaking of storage, the steps were a little bit more wobbly when vertical than I would have liked, so I needed to figure that out. I started with this plunger latch, which was a bad idea and didn't work. The stairs just pivoted on it, still floppy, and by installing a latch, now I just had a hole to fix. I turned it into a design element with a piece of contrasting walnut. This was half of my ultimate solution to the floppy stairs problem. 2 3D printed handle latches on a spinning shaft that keeps them oriented together and little ball latches to give them a nice satisfying click and hold it open or closed. The other part of the solution is a heavy duty ball latch at the top, complete with a 3D printed detent cup for the spring loaded ball to go into. Now I can put it all together and try it out. My anti-stair flop measures work pretty well, and the spring-loaded pivot hinge with the detents to keep the steps from moving work great.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
To make sure the steps are stable, the housing with the tracks also needs to be stable, and since the bottom has to be open, I added little feet to the front. They're on the outer corners, so it can be screwed to the floor of the pantry. This will secure it on all sides and keep the steps secure. These little feet are both dominoed and glued on. Once everything is installed, it'll be very solid. One of the last things to go onto the step storage box are these brackets, which will support some shelves. At this point, the steps were ready for final assembly, which involved adding some wood plugs to some of the hinge rod holes, followed by final sanding and finishing. I put on 3 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal, and when that was dry, I permanently installed the beef-up strap I made earlier. Then the hinge rods could go in permanently with beach plugs to fill the holes. I mentioned earlier that there were some very large cutting boards that also needed to be accommodated for in this design. The structure that will hold the steps will also hold the cutting boards in 2 large parallel slots on either side. I'm kind of breezing through this part of the build because this is getting long and the next video will feature much more of the shelf building. Right here, this is the top piece of the corner module, and I'm doing it like this to maximize the material I have on hand. Most of these seams will be covered by a Lazy Susan that I'll be making in the next part of this series. One thing I need to mention is that the doorway for this pantry is only 24 inches wide, so everything needs to be able to fit through that. This entire module with the step pack in it needs to be able to break down and be reassembled in the pantry to fit, so I'm only gluing where I can and many joints will be screws only. This lower corner module will break down into 5 pieces. The steps themselves, the box that holds the steps for storage, the left and right sides that also form the cutting board slots, and the top piece. The steps already have more exposed plywood edges than I really like, so you can be sure that the entire rest of the build will feature hardwood edges. I'm also not really a fan of exposed metal fasteners, but some of these are unavoidable. However, the few that will be exposed are on the undersides of parts or in inconspicuous places. The cardboard under me with the blue tape is an outline of the actual pantry floor plan to scale. I am testing that I can assemble the parts within the small space. Yeah, my body is outside the lines, but it didn't have to be, and this was to facilitate the camera positioning. Luckily, everything does fit, and hopefully this gives a sense of how this cornerstone piece goes together. In what will probably be 2 more videos, I'll build the rest of the shelves, some Lazy Susans, and illuminate the entire thing with LEDs. Here you can see how the steps work in situ. It'll be tight, and time will tell if this is useful or not. Worst case, the step module can be removed easily and a folding step stool will fit in its place. It has been a fun and challenging project just to get this far, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the rest of the pantry will come together. I can tell you that just getting this far has been an uphill climb, but I think the rest of the build will go a lot smoother. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first video in my custom pantry series, and if you made it this far, thanks for watching.